Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol has embarked on his official visit to Poland for talks with Polish President Andrzej Duda. Trade, investment, and cooperation in arms and nuclear power will likely top their agenda. Heavy monsoon rain is battering the nation. Rain alerts are in effect in the capital region, while in some parts of central regions, more than 400 millimeters of rainfall is forecast. South Korea's central bank has again kept its key rate steady at 3.5% amid the sluggish economy. The rate gap with the U.S. may further widen if the Federal Reserve takes another step to raise its rate in the coming weeks. It's July 13th, 2023. This is News Center. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yoon Jung-min. President Yoon Suk-yeol is soon to begin his bilateral talks with Polish President Andrzej Duda in Warsaw. This marks the South Korean leader's first official visit to Europe. Our presidential correspondent Oh Soo-young is in the Polish capital. Soo-young, let's begin with what the focus and significance of this summit will be.
Good evening, Tongmin. Well, as you said, we are yet to know the outcome of the summit because it hasn't begun yet. But according to Mr. Yoon's office, South Korea will be looking to deepen its strategic partnership with Poland as a platform to broaden Seoul's value-based cooperation with Europe, especially when it comes to Ukraine's restoration efforts. Let's take a listen to what his press secretary had to say.
Korea has a great deal of experience and outstanding technology in participating in post-war recovery projects. Based on this, the president has emphasized the need to present a vision for a liberal democracy that will contribute to the end of the war and the restoration of peace in Ukraine by participating in its reconstruction.
In this way, the South Korean president said that Poland is an indispensable partner for cooperation, and he hopes to strengthen solidarity with Warsaw in defending liberal democracy and pursuing world peace and prosperity. Now, he's also put particular emphasis on how South Korea and Poland both have a history of defending their sovereignty against totalitarianism and communism and quite unfriendly neighbors, and achieve democracy through the efforts of their citizens who long for freedom and solidarity.
And to put that kind of solidarity into action, the leaders will be expanding value-based economic cooperation.
That's right. Of course, Poland has been a growing market for South Korea's defense exports in particular. But now Seoul is looking to participate quite actively in Ukraine's restoration efforts and sees Warsaw as a hub for Ukraine's reconstruction in the future. Now, Mr. Yoon is also traveling with a delegation of 89 corporate leaders, notably in the construction, IT and logistics sectors, as well as the Export-Import Bank of Korea, all of which will attend a series of business events with the president.
At the Korea-Polish Business Forum, we expect to sign dozens of cooperation MOUs in various fields, including not only existing cooperation fields such as batteries, the defense industry, and nuclear power plants, but also cooperation in high-tech industries such as future cars, aviation, and AI, and cooperation in infrastructure and human resources.
Another senior official told reporters a couple of hours ago that Presidents Yoon and Duda will be penning a memorandum of understanding on Ukraine's reconstruction in particular. So that is one tangible outcome that we can expect to see in a couple of hours, I believe.
All right, thanks for your coverage. Do keep us updated, Soo-young. Over in Jakarta, top diplomats from South Korea and Japan met on the margins of the ASEAN-related meetings. On top of their agenda were Tokyo's plan to discharge Fukushima wastewater and North Korean missile threats, as were touched upon by President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishiras the previous day. Our foreign affairs correspondent Bae Eun-ji has more.
South Korean Foreign Minister Park Jin and his Japanese counterpart Yoshimasa Hayashi held a meeting in Indonesia's capital city of Jakarta to discuss a wide range of issues, including the wastewater discharge from the destroyed Fukushima nuclear power plant and North Korean threats. This is the first time in 2 months that the two officials have met in person. Their last meeting was in May in Hiroshima. During the closed-door meeting that lasted about 45 minutes, Park reportedly stressed that South Koreans' health and safety was his first and foremost concern, and said the Japanese government needed to take measures to reassure the public. He asked Japan to share its monitoring results of the discharge in real time with South Korea and to halt the release process if the concentration of radioactive material surpasses international standards. These are some of the measures that President Yoon also requested of Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida during their summit the previous day. In response, Hayashi reportedly said that his country would monitor the situation and take appropriate measures if the radioactivity measured exceeded limits. Also on the agenda was North Korea, especially since the meeting of the ASEAN Regional Forum, or ARF, set to take place in Jakarta on Friday, is a rare international occasion that the North takes part in. Both ministers strongly criticized the regime's missile test conducted the day before, with Park stressing that this was a serious violation of UN Security Council resolutions that could not be justified. He added it was regrettable that the North continues to ignore its people who are suffering from poverty and instead waste its assets on nuclear missile development. Ahead of the meeting, Park had also told reporters that it was important to show the international community's commitment to nuclear disarmament.
Through the ARF, the only multilateral security platform in the region that North Korea takes part in, it's important to show that the international community's efforts for denuclearization are stronger than the North's efforts to develop nuclear weapons.
It's likely that North Korean ambassador to Indonesia, An Kwang-il, will attend the ARF meeting on Friday instead of the regime's foreign minister. Peunji, Arirang News.
North Korea confirmed this morning that it test-fired a Hwasong-18 solid-fuel ICBM the previous day, observed by its leader Kim Jong-un. Experts say the missile appears to have the required range to potentially hit the U.S. and beyond. Our defense correspondent Choi Min-jung has more.
North Korea confirmed that it test-fired its Hwasong-18 solid-fuel ICBM on Wednesday under the watchful eye of leader Kim Jong-un. The North state-run news agency, the KCNA, on Thursday reported that the ICBM flew around 1,000 kilometers for more than 74 minutes at an altitude of over 6,600 kilometers before landing in the East Sea. It was the regime's second launch of the Hwasong-18 after its first test launch in April.
The first launch was to test the flight performance and separation process at a lower altitude. The second launch, however, tested not only the separation and flight performance but also the maximum performance of the engine at a much higher altitude.
With the current engine performance, the missile could also potentially hit anywhere in the world.
When fired at the right angle, it can fly more than 15 to 16,000 kilometers, so it has the required range to hit not only the US, but the entire world. The weapon is very dangerous in that sense.
The launch comes as North Korea accused the U.S. of plotting to use nuclear weapons against the regime under the Washington Declaration, which includes enhanced deployment of U.S. strategic assets in South Korea.
We can interpret the launch as a message of warning against the deployment of a U.S. nuclear ballistic submarine in South Korea.
Kim has also vowed to take a series of stronger military offensive actions until the U.S. and South Korea admit and give up their hostile policy against the regime. In response, the South Korean military said it will strengthen its defense posture against any threats from North Korea. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
Heavy rainfall is once again battering South Korea. This time, some central regions are expected to see over 400 millimeters. Torrential rain continues in the capital too. For more, we connect to our Shin Se-byuk, who is out at Jamsu Bridge in Seoul. Se-byuk, how is the situation out there?
Well, Changmin, I am at Jamsu Bridge, which crosses Hangang River in central Seoul. And as you can probably see, it's a real washout. The Korea Meteorological Administration has warned that we are in for an intense bout of concentrated downpours. The rain is pouring heavily along the west coast, and then it will move to the capital region starting tonight. This is because of a low-pressure system that is bringing a new, powerful monsoon front. The weather agency expects rainfall rates in Seoul and and the surrounding areas to reach 30 to 80 millimeters per hour, which triggers heavy rain alerts issued in the region. Until Saturday, the surrounding capital region will get 100 to 250 millimeters in total. And this is adding to concerns over possible damage as this round of torrential rain comes just 2 days after heavy rainfall had already battered the country. The ground has been softened, and that makes it easy for a landslide to occur. To that, President Yoon Suk-yeol ordered the government and related officials to make all-out efforts to prevent any damage and human casualties from the heavy rains. The Seoul Metropolitan Government, as of 9:30 a.m. this morning, has been working in emergency response mode to monitor possible damage. Seoul City is also taking action to make sure roads that are prone to flooding are blocked off.
That is very concerning. And which areas are expected to experience the most rainfall?
Well, Chungcheongnam-do and Jeollabuk-do provinces should literally brace for the essentially massive water bomb, and the monsoon front will linger in the capital region, though overnight it will travel southward to these regions from Friday morning. There will be over 400 millimeters of rain until Saturday, and other regions should also brace for torrential downpour of over 300 millimeters. And this includes Chungcheongbuk-do province, the southern part of Gyeonggi-do province, and parts of Gangwon-do and Gyeongsangbuk-do provinces. The weather agency has urged for thorough preparation as the monsoon front is expected to remain active, and heavy rain will continue periodically until the weekend. Citizens are advised to brace for potential damage and flooding. Now back to you, Jung-min.
All right, thanks for the coverage, Sebyok. Do stay safe. The nation's central bank yet again decides to keep its benchmark interest rate unchanged at 3.5%, taking into account a host of economic variables. Our finance correspondent Lee Dae-hyun reports.
The Bank of Korea has frozen its key interest rate for the fourth consecutive time. The central bank announced the decision following Thursday's Monetary Policy Committee meeting. With the rate freeze, the figure stays at 3.5%.
Inflation is expected to remain above the target level, and we still need to monitor the monetary policies of major countries and the household debt situation too. The Board of Governors voted unanimously to maintain the current tightening stance.
The BOK began raising the base rate in August 2021 when it decided to normalize the rate, which had been significantly lower due to COVID-19. But the base rate has remained at 3.5% since February. Concerns over the economy were the major factor behind the BOK's decision. However, it's still uncertain whether South Korea's economy will see a rebound in the second half of this year as the country awaits recovery in exports and domestic consumption. The Finance Ministry earlier this month lowered this year's economic growth outlook from 1.6 to 1.4%. The Bank of Korea also lowered its forecast to 1.4% amid sluggish recovery for the IT sector and the underwhelming impact of China's post-COVID reopening. The reason concerns over record-high delinquency rates against loans with the Korea Federation of Community Credit Cooperatives is another factor behind the decision. The cooperative has been struggling with liquidity woes and bank runs due to soaring loan defaults, which are causing anxiety in the financial market. The country is also seeing a slowing trend of consumer price raises, with the inflation rate last month dropping to the 2% range for the first time in almost 2 years. However, one expert says it's hard to say that rate hike factors are all gone.
Inflation rate can once again go up to 3% range. This 2.7% figure can't prove that the inflation is over, as it's due to the base effect of last year when the rate reached its peak.
The Bank of Korea says all members of the Board of Governors agree rate hikes to 3.75% are possible. Adding rate cuts are too early to call amid inflation uncertainty. Lee Dae-hyun, Arirang News.
Over in the U.S., the inflation hit its lowest point in more than 2 years. Despite the drop, the Fed officials have signaled another rate hike by a quarter point at its next meeting this month. Our Ji-young explains what this means for the rate gap between South Korea and the United States down the road.
The continued surge in U.S. consumer prices seen over the last 2 years finally seems to be cooling off. The latest consumer price index data from the Labor Department on Wednesday shows that U.S. annual inflation slowed to 3% last month from a year ago. It's been easing for 12 consecutive months, and it's a sharp fall from a 40-year high of more than 9% in June 2022. Some say then that the U.S. Central Bank's fastest monetary policy tightening campaign since 1980s is nearing an end. But with this still remaining above the Federal Reserve's 2% target rate, officials have signaled another rate hike by a quarter point at its next meeting in 2 weeks.
The sense of these summary of economic projections and the decision really is just that, given how far we've come, it may make sense to move rates higher, but to do so at a more moderate pace.
If the Fed raises the rate by 25 basis points this month, it'll widen the gap in rates between South Korea and the U.S. to a record high 2 percentage points. One expert says the widening gap between those rates could lead to capital outflow from South Korea, but he believes it's not likely to cause volatility in the foreign exchange market.
There is a chance that it might cause instabilities in the currency market and accelerated capital outflow, but right now that possibility seems very low. Even though the interest rate gap is 1.75 percentage points, the currency market has been relatively stable.
The same expert adds, as long as it is slow and steady, the Korean economy can handle it, and that the country is currently in a position where the risks of raising the rates outweigh the risks of maintaining them. 엄지영, Arirang News.
Japan's imminent wastewater release from its damaged Fukushima nuclear power plant is already causing a decrease in seafood consumption in neighboring South Korea, sparking concerns by fishermen. Our Moon Hye-ryun went out for a fact check on seafood safety.
This empty market in Seoul is one of South Korea's biggest fish markets. So why is there nobody around?
The first thing to greet visitors at Norangjin Fisheries Wholesale Market is a wide array of colorful banners. They read, "Our seafood is safe, buy with confidence," and false horror stories about nuclear wastewater are unacceptable. And this is what's keeping the market empty. Widespread concerns over the safety of seafood with the impending release of treated wastewater from Japan's damaged Fukushima nuclear plant. Sales at fishery markets such as this have plummeted, putting the livelihoods of merchants at stake.
Sales have fallen to half the amount they were before, despite media outlets and the Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries saying that there are no radioactive substances like cesium in the water.
The few people seen at the market are those that believe the formal reports released by the IAEA last week and the government's endorsement that the treated wastewater meets international standards.
The government says it's safe, so I'll eat it. I'm only going to be buying enough to eat today and store only a little.
Fishermen are also feeling the brunt of the impact. With the South Korean government having no immediate plans to lift import restrictions on food sourced from Fukushima, it's fish caught in neighboring waters that people are avoiding. Boats in harbors are sitting idle as a result.
Us fishermen depend on how much we sell at what price for a living. But prices have fallen to a third of last year's prices.
Unlike the plummeting sales of seafood, sales of sea salt and dried seaweed have jumped in retail stores.
As you can see here, there's a sign explaining the lack of salt on the shelves. This company has seen sales of sea salt up by 150% and sales of dried seaweed up by more than 20% across its stores.
As these items have a longer shelf life, people are buying them to store before the release of the treated wastewater.
It's been almost a fortnight since we last had any coarse sea salt on the shelves. Customers began panic buying before that when they heard the news.
Sea salt is an integral part of South Korean cuisine. Not only is it used in the national dish kimchi, but it's also used in sauces for many dishes.
Soy sauce is also made using salt, so that's becoming more popular these days too. A lot of customers are buying soy sauce now that they think they can't buy it later.
But by this logic, shouldn't consumers be eating as much seafood as they can before the release of the treated wastewater?
Consumption is based on psychology. Consumers often decide to buy things purely based on how they're feeling, and in this case, their concerns are affecting what they buy or don't buy.
This means that easing these concerns should take priority above directly attempting to boost consumption of seafood, such as the government's plans to provide cash vouchers worth around $50.2 million to consumers.
I think these concerns will be eased with transparent, regular, and continuous sharing of accurate information by the government.
With consumers being able to access information freely online, whether it's correct or not, the Korea Consumer Agency warned against fraudulent advertisements after some circulated on the net encouraging consumers to hoard sea salt. Experts at home are eager to clarify such misinformation.
The salt will be no different from the salt produced following the damage of the plant back in 2011, containing minimal traces of cesium, strontium, and plutonium. The tritium that isn't filtered out in treated wastewater evaporates with the water.
As Japan's neighboring country, the release of treated wastewater is an issue which is closer to home for South Korea than other countries. It looks as though only time and transparent information sharing will be able to ease the burden on consumers and fishermen alike. Moon Hae-ryun, Arirang News.
A monsoonal rain system will continue to batter the nation with heavy downpours. For now, heavy rain alerts are issued for parts of central regions, including the Seoul metropolitan area and Gangwon-do province. Be extra careful out on the roads tonight. For parts of Chungcheongnam-do and Jeollabuk-do provinces, extreme downpours are expected, with up to 400 millimeters in the forecast. The surrounding regions, including here in Seoul, will see up to 300. Torrential rainfall will continue to lash inland regions until this Saturday. Locally, heavy downpours are expected for the Seoul metropolitan area tonight. For tomorrow, a group of heavy rain clouds will move towards Gyeonggi-do and Gangwon-do provinces. By Saturday, rain clouds will move down towards the south of the country, spreading heavy showers across the region. When they start, torrential downpours of 30 to 80 millimeters per hour will batter the region. Under rainy spells, Seoul and Busan will be starting off at 24 degrees Celsius. As for the daily highs, Seoul will get up to 26, Gwangju 28, Gyeongju will reach 29 degrees. Until next Monday, the entire nation will see monsoonal showers. That's all for now, and here are the weather conditions around the world. That is News Center for tonight. Thanks for watching. A panel session coming up.
I'm Gustav Slamečka, Czech ambassador. Arirang TV is doing its best as a media diplomacy channel representing Korea by delivering current affairs information and news in a balanced voice. Everyone I meet can get news about Korea through Arirang, and we are thankful. I hope Arirang TV will continue to take the lead in delivering Korea's news to the world, and I hope it will be a channel for the world and Korea to synthesize. Resonating with the world, Arirang.
Hello everyone, it's Thursday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. President Yoon wrapped up his schedule at the NATO summit on Wednesday and the same day headed to Poland for a state visit. While in Lithuania, South Korea and NATO institutionalized a framework for cooperation by establishing the ITPP, increasing the number of areas of cooperation to 11. A series of talks also took place, including a four-party summit with other countries from the Asia-Pacific region and bilateral summits such as one with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. Today's edition of
Within the Frame aims to provide a wrap-up of the president's activities in Lithuania. And for this, we invite Professor An Jun-sung from Yonsei University Graduate School of International Studies. Professor An, welcome.
Thank you.
And we also have Professor Robert Kelly from Busan National University. Professor Kelly, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
All right, first question to our Professor An. Now, as a leader of an observer country, President Yoon Suk-yeol attended this year's NATO summit. What is this observer position, and what does it mean for South Korea to attend this meeting for 2 consecutive years?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And then, well, I have to begin with the correction here, because that, as a matter of law, there's no observer status at the NATO at this time. So they just call it observer. I'm not quite sure how some Korean media use the term observer, but because that from international law perspective, for example, like United Nations, they have a special term like a permanent observer. And so when you say using the observer term, means then there's kind of a candidate member state to become a full member, something. So there's kind of implication there. So I guess that we should not use that observer the term. Instead, they officially, according to NATO, they use the global partner.
Global partner.
Yeah, I think that's the correct term. The media have to use it, global partner.
All right.
And about 2 consecutive years, yeah, it's very interesting. From last year, the NATO initiated further deepening the relations with the Asian Pacific countries, including Korea, right? So I think that's the one they started, and then they invited as the group, right, as group of 4, and Korea was one of them. And then because I guess the point is here that at this moment, the NATO need Korea more than Korea needs NATO.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, that's I think the things how I see my perspectives.
Right, Professor An, one more question. So, like you said, inviting South Korea is part of NATO's efforts to deepen its collaboration with major countries in the Pacific partners, or should I say Asia-Pacific partners. And before we delve into the details, why is building a relationship with these countries in this region so important in NATO's point of view?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there's 3 factors I think that NATO is considered very important. First was obviously the Russian issue because of the Ukraine war, and second was the China factor, since they see it as a systematic threat, something like kind of future concern, and just like what President Biden think about China. Look at it as an ultimate enemy, right? And then thirdly, I'm not sure how much NATO really care about North Korean nuclear threat, because it's kind of far away, and it's not really direct conflict with North Korea, because some of the European countries has much better relation than South Korea or the U.S., right? So I guess that's the things that for them to invite us to join their meetings, I guess they need something, some reason for us to be there, right? So I think that's kind of their third priority factor about North Korean nuclear threat, right? However, I'll just put it more put it there in the situation here. Also, that there's difference about AP4, and because some Korean media using the AP4, the Asian Pacific 4, but actually I checked the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan, they call it IP4.
IP4.
Yeah, interesting. I looked it up, New Zealand and then Australia. I said, oh, this IP4, and I checked the NATO website, they call it IP4.
Oh, okay.
The Indo-Pacific 4. I think that I checked the Korean, presidential office, press release, they call AP4. I think they should correct it to IP4.
All right, I see. Now, Professor Kelly, during the meeting with his counterparts from the Indo-Pacific region, President Yoon urged the establishment of a strong collective security posture. How specifically could these 4 countries work together in this area?
Yeah, so I think the Yoon presidency, generally the president and the staff around him, believe that Korea should play a larger role in the Indo-Pacific, that it shouldn't be sort of trapped or mired just in Korea, just sort of in this sort of relationship with North Korea of 2 scorpions in the bottle, and I think Yoon wants sort of a wider view. This is, I think, in real contradistinction to the Moon administration, which really focused very heavily on North Korea alone. Right. And I think the Yoon argument is that Korea will find greater security if it does that, right? That Korea is sort of facing challenges not just from North Korea, but also obviously from China and to a certain extent from Russia, even if it's arguably in decline, right? And so it makes sense for the Yoon administration to reach out to partners in the region, right? Of course, the Americans have pushed this, and the Americans are sort of Korea's most important strategic partner, so it kind of makes sense for the Koreans to at least sort of kind of nod in the direction of what the Americans are looking for, right? And all these countries sort of share basic values and concerns about China's rise and stuff like that, right? I'm looking at your screen there, right? You know, Australia and Japan, all these countries are sort of worried about the same kind of things. So in a sense, it makes good sense, right? I mean, there's a sort of, you know, obvious sort of centrality or jointness of interest here, right? I think it's a little different than NATO, right? Because the countries are much more widely spread apart, whereas in NATO, you have a lot of geographic contiguity, right? You also have the unique sort of historical issues between Korea and Japan. But I mean, the general concern that China is rising, North Korea's nuclear weapons are dangerous, you know, these unite countries in Asia, even arguably India, I would say too, right? And these countries should be sort of getting together to work roughly to push back on this. And I think that logic is pretty clear, just from sort of looking at the map. And I think the Yoon government has grasped that, and the partners in the region, you know, obviously like that, right? I mean, the Australians and the Indians and so on, and Japanese want that too. And so I think you're getting a meeting of the minds.
Right, I see. Professor Kelly, one more question to you. The leaders of this four-party summit, they said they will seek to institutionalize a cooperation framework with NATO and take a leading role in regional security. What does this tightening cooperation between NATO and this AP4 countries mean? I mean, how would this be viewed by other countries like China or Russia?
Yeah, this is tricky, right? Sort of whether or not NATO should have some kind of sustained presence in Asia and vice versa, right? And which have sort of like the emergence of kind of like some kind of Asian NATO or some kind of embryonic thing, right? With the idea of like the Quad or the Quad plus 2 or 3 or whatever, right? Is that kind of like an embryonic Asian NATO? And if it is, should it be linked to sort of the NATO in the North Atlantic, right? And all these ideas are kind of floating around in the background. I think the larger concern here is that there is a commonality of interest across these democracies, particularly about China, less so about North Korea and Russia, both of which have significant power constraints, right? Russia's in decline, North Korea's in, you know, pretty small. Without its nuclear weapons, we wouldn't be worrying about it so much. I think the real issue for the future is China. Everybody's worried about that, right? I mean, you know, not just the Koreans and the Japanese and the Australians, but a lot of European countries, the Americans. And so it kind of makes sense for these countries all to sort of talk together, right? I mean, the more China talks a sort of tough revisionist game, which it has done under Xi Jinping, right? The rhetoric is a lot tougher than it was 10 or 15 years ago, the more that's going to drive the democracies together. And of course, this is something that the Biden administration has emphasized a lot, right? That world politics is sort of this contest between autocracies and democracies, right? And the democracies cooperate. And, you know, if you believe in democracy and liberalism, I mean, that kind of makes sense, right? I mean, the Koreans and the Germans and the Americans and the Australians all share a basic set of values, and all of them worry about other democracies being eliminated, right? I mean, Europeans would worry if Taiwan got invaded. You know, Asian countries like Japan and Korea and Australia worry about Ukraine getting invaded. So, I mean, there's a commonality of interest, a commonality of shared values. And it's not, I don't think it's too surprising that all these countries are sort of knitting themselves together. It's going to take a long time, and there's no big formal institution coming soon. But I mean, the basic idea that they should all be working together for strategic and political reasons, democracy, I don't think that's really up for much debate anymore. I think that's pretty well established at this point.
All right, I see. So commonality of the shared values are making them work together. Now, Professor Ahn, tapping on specific deal between South Korea and NATO, they adopted an individually tailored partnership program, or ITPP, so they say. But before we delve deeper into this, as far as I know, they already had this partnership called Individual Partnership and Cooperation Program. What is the difference between ITPP and this IPCP?
Well, just put it there, because given the fact that there is no, you know, the status issue, right? It's not really open to the membership to the Korea or Japan. It's more like invited to be participated to the NATO meetings, right? And things about last time when NATO invited Korea, well, not in Korea, Korea and Japan, for two other nations, right? Basically, when they invited, we kind of signed like agreement. Bilateral, well, each bilateral, right, with the NATO, Korea and the NATO, Japan and NATO, right? And they become like, it's not really member, but become like a allied partner, global partner membership. So you have a global partner membership, and this one is ITPP is upgrade version, means that we have a specific area of the cooperation, specific 11 areas you focus on it. So we have more detail. I think that the previous arrangement is really general description of, you know, about what to do, we cooperated. But this one is more specific areas to cooperate, how they cooperate, I think that's a much more advancement and then development is a very good sign. However, I'm looking at the Japanese side, interesting, Japan already signed the same contract earlier, and then they had a cooperation area is the 16 compared to 11, right?
Oh.
So, and plus there's a big about news. If you see that the Japanese government tried to open the liaison office, NATO, like what the Professor Kelly say, the Asian NATO, right? Basically, they tried to open at Tokyo at the liaison office, but some of the NATO countries, including France, kind of disagree with it. So they don't want expansion to the Asia. So that's one issue. And plus, very interesting. I checked the press release and the NATO website, and I think July 12, I think the Secretary General saying that Japan is closer than any other country, you know, so any other partner. So it's they show very strong, I guess. Interest in Japan, but I think that about this NATO, visiting about issue here, that we have to think about big picture. You see, what is our national interest for the Korean, right? What is the national interest for Korea? Are we doing our best for our best interest, or are we doing something is not doing best for some other countries? I think that's a big question they have to ask themselves.
Right, I see. So to sum up, the ITPP is an upgraded version and a detailed version than IPCP. So Professor Kelly, the partnership has been upgraded and has expanded bilateral cooperation to 11 sectors, including, for example, disarmament and non-proliferation. Could you give us details on what areas this program covers?
Yeah, so I think the future sort of jointness and some level of integration, right? And we know that arms control, the Yoon administration has emphasized this a lot, right? I mean, just the other day, the president said this, right? Arms control is a big thing, in part because of North Korea, right? South Korea is sort of increasingly facing a missilized North Korea. It's very clear that if we're ever going to get real security in South Korea, it's going to require some kind of cap or some kind of constraint on North Korea's missilization. Missile defense doesn't work well enough, so the Yoon administration is emphasizing disarmament, right? I presume this also means, again, we don't know. We'll have to see how this sort of shakes out, right? It's sort of like the nuclear consultative group. It's between the U.S. and Korea. It's going to sort of take life as it sort of gets put together on the fly. I would imagine sort of also in the future going to concern issues like nuclear security and non-proliferation. Again, sort of from the Korean perspective, this is all pretty important, right? And larger arms control, again, that would probably be, that would sort of move around, that would sort of begin to focus on sort of China and Taiwan, right? And concerns, maybe we can have some like maritime caps or something like that so the United States and China don't tumble into a major naval race in the region, the same way they saw between sort of Britain and France, for example, Britain and Germany before World War I. Right, so I would imagine that all these kinds of issues, interoperability, arms control, finding a way to sort of like hammer out differences to create sort of a common front on shared issues like Ukraine, Taiwan, North Korea. I would imagine that all those things are sort of floating in the background, and that's sort of, again, sort of looking at the pictures there, right? I mean, all this stuff will sort of come together, right? Whether or not there'll be actually formal mechanisms that sort of that are actually stood up, something like an Asian NATO, I'm kind of doubtful there. Instead, what you get is sort of per the title there, right? You'll get a lot of intergovernmental interaction. You'll probably see the Koreans and the Japanese invited more and more to things like the G7, the G20, well, they're already in that, NATO and things like that, right? In an effort to kind of like build some kind of basic intergovernmental structure, some kind of regular symmetry that brings all the democracies under one umbrella to sort of push for the same things, right? Sort of like nuclear disarmament across the board, for example, would be an obvious one, which could capture North Korea, right? Some kind of constraints on sort of like maritime operations in East Asia, right? Some kind of rules of the road for the South China Sea so that we can find a way, hopefully, to track China into better behavior, right? All the democracies share interest in that, and I would imagine that those are the kinds of things that will show up.
Right, I see your point. Now, Professor Ahn, increasing military information sharing with the NATO alliance was another agreement reached. And though details were not shared, the presidential office said that what President Yoon was referring to NATO's BICES, which was Battlefield Information Collection and Exploitation System. What is this about, and how is this expected to benefit South Korea?
It's a very interesting question because I ask myself, why they want to share it, right? And then I look it up, and interesting about here that let me begin with this perspective. This is like A4 or the AP4 or IP4, right, is invited as a group by the NATO. It's not Korean government approached NATO. We want to join you, whatever reason, right? They're not going to accept it because of their discretion to whether or not they invited 9 member states. So basically, they need us, Korea and other countries, to join them for their own purposes, right? So what I'm hearing about here, interesting is that the way they got joined that, kind of invited. Actually, the NATO General Secretary suggests, the Korean government to join the BICES. So it's very interesting because if you look at the other way, it's a very sensitive information. It's military, including nuclear information. So if some other non-member state, I would like to share your military, sensitive military information data networks, no country will say, oh yes, right? Unless they invited to do so. But that's one thing that NATO initiated. And second is that there is not really highly sensitive information level. I guess that there's a basic level of information they're sharing, and then already we are sharing with the U.S. anyway, right? So it's not really big deal about in terms of the sensitivity of information. Now the last one is I'm also very wondering about it's called like BICES, battlefield. It's like, what do you mean battlefield? We're far away from the Europe, right? So it's more. I think they were kind of expanding the idea about the scope of the battlefield into the cyberspace, cyber warfare, and hacking or something like that. So those could also like some having so relates to hack some system and about the cryptocurrency issues, right? So there would be might be degree of cooperation between IPP and the NATO. Yes, they should, but at this moment we because of the sensitive information, the government would not share how much they're sharing the information, but well, we wait and see how much. But I think that's a good sign. I think there's a NATO side perspective is that they will try to sending a political message to their enemies like Russia and China, or we're sharing military information like you sharing with your brothers, right, comrade, right? Basically, I think there's more a political gesture from the NATO side.
All right, I see. So in that case, that being said, could we say this BICES thing is very much focused on cybersecurity and a political gesture to show perhaps China and Russia that we are all together?
From NATO perspective, I think.
All right, I see. Now, Professor Kelly, Yoon also took part in bilateral summits with leaders of more than 10 countries, for example, like Norway and the Netherlands. What significance does having such bilateral summits with European countries have? And specifically, what areas were focused on?
Yeah, so again, I think this is sort of part of the general approach from the Yoon government to sort of widen Korea's reach, sort of global Korea. Korean conservative governments have often talked this way, right? That Korea should have sort of this wider footprint. It should play a larger role. I think there's this desire to sort of break away from the perception that South Korean foreign policy is entirely structured by the competition with North Korea. Again, sort of looking at the footage here, right? You can see sort of Yoon shaking hands with various leaders and stuff like that, and right, to sort of raise the profile of Korea as sort of this larger and a more important state, right? Korea is the world's 10th biggest economy, so it's systemically important, right? So presumably it has important trade and financial relationships with many of these partners, right? And I think the Yoon administration wants to kind of layer on top of that an increasing security relationship, again, for the reasons I sort of talked about before, right? The perception that South Korea is sort of, if you will, broadly speaking, in the democratic camp, in this sort of emerging contest, right, where you have sort of like China and Russia, which have grown significantly closer because of the war, and also North Korea, right, which is kind of floating around in that camp too. And North Korea is really on the front line of that contest, right? And if there's ever a Korean war, there's a second Korean war, Korea is going to reach out, not just the United States, but presumably to most of the democratic world and say, help us, sanctions and things like that, right? So I would caution against the arguments made that, what's going on in Ukraine doesn't really matter to us, that's sort of far away, and NATO is sharing, they want our information, stuff like that, and it's not that important for us. I would really strongly disagree with that, right? If things go hot in Korea, if there's a conflict in Korea, all these relationships you see right there are going to become really, really important for Korea in order to sanction China, sanction North Korea, right? Sort of keep a Korean war from becoming, a really, not a defeat, but, like a major catastrophe for South Korea. South Korea is going to want a lot of allies, and sort of participating in the coalition that supports Ukraine is a good way for South Korea to sort of prove that it's a good sort of global citizen among democracies. So when South Korea calls for help, other countries will assist it, right? And that, I think, is really the background story of what Yoon is doing. With the financial relationships, the trade relationships, that's all great. But what really matters ultimately for Korea, I think, is the security issue, right? Which is that Korea is fairly exposed. It's right next to China. It's right next to North Korea. It's right next to Russia. And if things ever get really bad, if there's ever a conflict out here, Korea is right on the front line, and it's going to want a lot of allies. And I think the Yoon administration really realizes that, right? And sort of being friends with the Americans and the Japanese isn't enough. It helps to have a much, much wider reach. And that's, I think, why the Yoon government is emphasizing this idea of sort of democratic collectivity so much more.
Right, I see your point in that South Korea is trying to have more allies in case there is anything happening on the peninsula. Now, Professor Ahn, now among many bilateral summits, talks with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida was the one that gathered a lot of attention, as Tokyo tried to reassure Seoul about the release of the wastewater from the Fukushima nuclear power plant. Now, how did you see the developments of the discussion?
Yeah, very interesting development. And I read the official press release by the president's office. Basically, I think they have 3 points, right? First is that they want from Japan's government immediate, the real-time information sharing about what's going on, whatever happens. And the second is that the Korean government want Korean experts to participate in the monitoring process. Right. And the last one is that if something bad thing happen, they want an immediate stop about something bad thing happen or exceeding their some safety level, and then immediate notification to Korea. Yeah, I guess both parties agree. But how is it very interesting? I think that the bilateral relationship between Korea and Japan has very historical, bearing. A lot of things happens. But let me ask you the very interesting question: is that the Korea and Japan friends now? I remember I just watching. I saw that. I think that the Prime Minister Kishida saying something like "안녕하세요," right? Something. Well, I think it's a good gesture. But I checked the Foreign Affairs Office on the website, and I was very surprised how they describe the situation here in Korea. the NATO. And according to the Minister of Foreign Affairs Japan, they call the way the order they put country in Korea. Well, historically we call like in Korea, in U.S., maybe probably China and Japan, and then other countries. But they put it like Japan, Austria, New Zealand, and Korea. There's official statement. I was very surprised, and because considering the geographic, proximity, or Asian, New Zealand far away from Japan, and they put it, and I guess if they want to be really showing their effort, something, I guess they other than just speaking something, they should be treated. By showing the good effort, good gesture effort, and they change their policy, their attitude about how they deal with Korea. Because a lot of history between two countries, but if we want to change a new start, and they have to do some work, because there's some Koreans kind of criticizing about administration. They're giving everything, give away everything, but what are you getting in return, right? So great things they at least show that some gesture or something. Yeah, I guess that's kind of things that I'm expecting from the Japanese side, showing some goodwill gesture to the Korea. And that's the will help developing, improving the bilateral relation between two countries.
All right, I see your point. Now, Professor Kelly, I believe this will be our last question. President Yoon is now in Poland, actually, with a press briefing soon to take place following a meeting with his Polish counterpart. What discussions could we expect to have taken place?
Oh, specifically with Poland? Oh, I would imagine that a lot. First of all, there's going to be the sort of like the basic sort of Korean effort to get the World Expo down here in Busan, right? That would be really great for us, right? I think one of the things that Yoon is doing up there in Europe is trying to sort of rustle up votes. So, good for him. I hope he gets it, right? And then the standard kind of export relationships, right? Korea is an export-driven economy. You all know this, right? Korea exports a lot to Europe, so I would imagine that Yoon is sort of banging away on that. But again, I would argue, as I have throughout this interview, that the larger strategic context is what really matters, right? The Eastern European countries are a much more important part of NATO than they were 15, 20 years ago. They are now on the front line against Russia. They're all going to be spending a great deal more on defense in the future, right? Because of the obvious parallels between the Ukraine conflict and a Taiwan scenario, or arguably a Korean scenario. I think, again, there's sort of a lot of interest in, well, how the Europeans are helping Ukraine. Would you see a larger effort to assist South Korea in a Korean contingency? Would you see a larger effort to assist Taiwan in a regional contingency there with the Chinese, right? We're all, again, I think the Yoon administration would argue that they kind of accept the sort of Biden argument that all these democracies are more or less in the same place, that they're all kind of looking at the same collection of autocratic actors, a lot of them quite honestly supported by Chinese money and trade, to be perfectly blunt, right? And that we need to find a way, right? We, the democracies, need to find a way to sort of stand together and push back on this. And Poland is one of the biggest actors in NATO now, right? It's now the most important Eastern European country in NATO, right, which means it's really the front line. On Russia, it's been very, very hard and tough on Russia, and very supportive of Ukraine, right? And again, sort of if you're in an Asian state like South Korea or Taiwan and you're exposed to that kind of competition from China and North Korea, those are the kinds of partners I think you want. And I think that's what Yoon is doing. I think the strategy stuff is really the backdrop. The trade issues are, they're nice, but I would argue the strategic issues are what really matter here.
All right, I see. Now, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. But thank you, Professor Kelly, for your insights, and Professor Ahn for your insights as well. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.
한국에 오면 먹어야죠.